Nice.
What's the potato salad?
We cup up this.
Oh, right.
I don't do sugar or carbs.
Hello, everyone. Part 2.
Minimal carbs, but no sugar,
Here's
no
a good
carbs.
carb replacement.
Is that?
It's chickpeas.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah. My brother just started eating solids today.
Mm.
So it's huge.
That
huge.
is.
He was on the tube feed for over 10 months, and now the very first meal today.
Lumsit.
Amazing.
Lots of lumsit, lots of
Well, he's bumped. We did a swallowing assessment at Nanaimo Regional on Friday, and he went from not eating for over 10 months because he got hit by a car last summer, and he was intubated for a long time with a trach tube, and that was for almost 2 months, which is a hugely long time to be intubated in the trach. Usually more than 2 days is starting to become problematic, but it was almost 2 months for him to be intubated in the throat. And then from there, it was a direct feed tube into the stomach. And that's where what he's had for the last 10 months. And so today we went for a swallow assessment on Friday, and he went through them all so well. And then he's ready to eat solids as long as it's cut up. So he just jumped right in. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going.
No, it's okay.
No, I don't want to be on the camera.
Oh, I forgot about that thing.
All right. Are we live?
We are live.
Okay, perfect. So now, this is our second part of the study session, and now we're going to be focusing more specifically upon a review of the exercises from handouts 1 through 10. And we will just be looking specifically at the exercises that were assigned in class. And so as we go through each handout, we will be sure to highlight those essential assignments that were handed out. My list shows that nearly everyone has completed these assignments. So if not, this is just good for review, and you can go over this with your returned marked assignments with you to go over this to develop an even deeper understanding as we go through this exercise. So we're going to backtrack and go to handout 1. And in handout 1, the assignments that were associated with that were exercises 2, 3, 4, and 6. So, okay. Well, we'll make our way through it.
1, 2, 3, 4, 6.
Is that what everybody else has?
That's what I got.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's take a look. Handout 1. Again, is what is linguistics, and it just kind of focuses on those subfields of linguistics. And the question asks, what do you find interesting about language? And the sub-question here is, are you interested in any particular subfield of linguistics? Oh, this is one that we didn't do, sorry. The first question on exercise 2 is, why are these 6 subfields important for language revitalization? So we talked about this in the overview of the handouts, those 6 subfields. This is an open-ended question. There isn't really a correct answer to this. It's more of just getting a conversation started and kind of getting a bit more of an understanding for yourself as to why you're in the course in the first place. Why would linguistics have an importance in the work that you do, in your efforts to learn our language, etc.? So really, there's no wrong answers, but everybody kind of gravitates to the same type of a response, which is fine and is natural. Most people will indicate that these subfields of linguistics are helpful because when we're trying to teach the language to new learners, that we can understand all those different parts, the meaningful parts and sounds of our language, to make it easier for new learners, right? That's one of the common responses that we'll get for this particular exercise. But we all, depending on our individual sort of approaches and experiences, we might have different ideas of why these 6 subfields are important to language revitalization. And in fact, it could go to the far end of the spectrum where somebody might feel that none of these subfields have any relevance to our language revitalization, that they might just be problematic, and there's might be a better way to go about it, which would be just strictly immersion. You know, so again, there's no right or wrong answer for this. Basically, we just want to start the conversation on linguistics and whether or not it's important to you, and if it is important, what about it is important. And understanding that linguistics is, the term linguistics is a broad, overarching type of a term, and there's a whole bunch of small subfields that make up linguistics in its entirety. And so we talked about some of those pieces earlier. Exercise 3. Different languages do not use all the same sounds. What sounds do Newtonal and English share? What sounds are found only in one or the other? For most of us entering into these courses, we already have a little bit of an understanding of that because we've already started to pick up some of the pieces of neutronal phonetics and neutronal sounds, and we have already understood the difference between some of the sounds that are only found in neutronal and some of the sounds that are only found in English, and thirdly, some of the sounds that are found in both. And so this exercise is helping us to draw that out a little bit more. Very quickly, the barred lambda, ka, is a very neutronal specific sound. The G sound, the g, is a very English-oriented sound, but the plain K, ka, is found in both. There's an example. And so this exercise is asking you to identify some of those pieces. You could identify all of them if you want. You could identify some of them. It's up to you. Exercise 4. How are the following words related? Can you identify any parts that are smaller than a word, but meaningful? What do these parts mean? This part tends to be a little bit confusing at first, especially for people who don't know the language very well yet. A lot of learners who enter into these courses may only know a few key words, if any at all. Sometimes we get people who aren't even neutronal and haven't even heard the language spoken, and yet we can start to immediately break the language apart, regardless of how much of background experience we have in the language. So that's really what this exercise is looking at. Basically, when we're looking at meaningful parts, what we can do is we take a whole bunch of examples, not just one, but we want to get a whole bunch of examples of words that sound the same or start the same. And then we can start to understand that, okay, each of these words start with the glottal wedge C and an I. So, ya, nu, they're starting with the same kind of a sound. So that must mean that beginning piece. And now we also understand that in neutronal, the root is almost always found at the very beginning of the word. So in this case, we can already immediately identify, without perhaps knowing what the word means, that is the very first part in the word, so is likely the root. The next word, is a continuation of that. So they're related in that sense. So ya means cutting fish. Nut means a totem pole. So nut actually means cutting along a line, which is physically what we're doing to a totem pole, right? We're cutting it along in a line. That's why we call it nut. So that from that understanding that we just developed, we can appreciate that has to do with cutting. So anytime we hear at the beginning, it likely has to do with cutting. If it's a glottal wedge C followed with a short I or a long I, then it's going to be like it up. It up is the, I can't remember what they call it in English, but it's the basket weaving grass that has these sharp edges that we often get cut with, right, when we pull along on it. So it's a plant that cuts, but we use it for weaving. And then in that word, we hear the same root being applied at the beginning. So we can start to immediately see that some of those small little meaningful parts, which later on in the handouts we learn to call morphemes, that we can start to distinguish, even if we didn't know this before. So let's look at these other examples on the right-hand column, because they all start with the same sound, ma, either ma or ma. So mahdi is house, ma'as is home, village or tribe, ma'as is families or tribes or a gathering of families and tribes, and ma'nuh is a word for, well, it's used in different contexts. It could mean world, it could mean houses all along one another, from like side by side, going along in a long distance. But what we do notice in each of these words is that they start with the same sound. So knowing that the root in our neutronal language is found at the beginning, we can identify that the root here is ma, and that the similarity in the translations is house or home or having to do with people living in a certain place. So now we can understand that ma is a morpheme that means people living in a certain place of some sort, right? And the next example that we have here is with nuchi and neutronal. So nuchi and neutronal both start with nuch and nuch, and they both are pertaining to mountain. So we can start to deduce that nuch is a morpheme or a meaningful part, a root word in this case, that refers to mountain. A word that we don't hear very often, but it would fit in with that, is nuch-yu. Nuch-yu is one way that we say mountains, plural. Right? So nuchi Nuchano. So now we've identified that at the beginning we have the roots and there's some similarities in the roots and we can start to understand what those root words mean. But some of the endings are similar, like anush, anush and manush and nuchanush, and even in chinush is the same ending that's being applied. And so if we look at it, at the very literal meaning of chinush, meaning cutting along a line, nuchano means mountains along the coastline, and manush means housing or dwelling or people living all along in a line. So then we can appreciate that there's another meaningful part that's being applied in these different words, which is anush, or a variation of anush. And so in nuchano or manush or chinush, it's the same part, the same meaningful part that's being added that means relatively the same thing. It means along a line, right? So that's the exercise that we're looking at there. And that's exercise number 4. The next one is exercise number 6, I believe. There is no 6.
On page 4.
Okay, perfect.
Serious, yeah.
Oh, so it cuts to page 4, handout 2.
Yeah.
Exercise number 6 is, the question is, consider these words from Nuchano and English. Which words are opposed to each other in each language? How are these two systems different? So chako carries the English meaning man or husband. Tlutsma carries the English meaning woman or wife. Hakwak can mean young woman or daughter in English. Hawikuk means young man and son. Koas, person, man, or native person. Chims means bear. Nani usually means grizzly, but in some dialects is another way of just saying bear. Tikwik and tikwas mean to sit, and nas could mean day or creator. So what this is asking is, it's asking, where's the question? About opposition. So let's go back to the first part of handout 2, and where is it? There's one part here that speaks directly to opposition, I thought. No, maybe it doesn't. Okay, maybe that would be helpful to have one of the terms describe what opposition refers to in a linguistic term. I thought that it included that, but apparently it doesn't.
I thought it would, and I was wondering if it had to do with that conversation about being genetically related. That was a concept that I didn't quite understand.
Right. That's more about language family in the next group, and how different languages may have influenced one another, right? Whether it's through direct contact with each other or just over time that it's kind of morphed into those similarities. In this case, what we're looking at is looking at words that are opposed to each other. So this is more about the structure, the syntactical or syntactic structure, just basically the way that sentences are structured, or the word meaning itself and having a sort of an oppositional meaning. It's a difficult concept to articulate.
So kind of like the man and woman.
Yeah.
Without getting into politics about gender-specific things that are going on in 2018.
And one of the oppositions between the languages that we're talking about here, which isn't necessarily the meaning of the words, but the fact is that in Nuchano, chakop can mean many things. Whereas in English, there's a lot of different words to describe those many things. You wouldn't use man for husband or for anything else. They have very specific words and meanings that are associated with it. Whereas in Nuchano, chakop can mean multiple things. Flutsma can mean woman or wife, but there's 2 separate words in English for that. And the example keeps going on with each of the words that are listed there.
And,
right?
And just following the train of thought, kuas and chims would not be opposing words because there are other things out there that are like kuas, and the word for all animals would be opposing words because that would encompass the 2 things in that kind of living.
Right. If we were doing oppositional within the same language, we can look at the oppositional between English and Nuchano and how they're different from one another in the sense that it really what we're getting to is that they don't have the same meaning, really, right? Like but if they have the exact same meaning, then they're not as oppositional to each other. So it is a difficult concept to to fully grasp in this sense, and it's one that is a very linguistic focused type of a terminology that we don't often use. It's kind of like the place and manner information of how consonants are constructed. We likely would not tell learners that it's a bilabial fricative that is voiceless, right? That won't mean anything to most people that we talk to, but it's good for us to understand it because it develops a deeper understanding for ourselves as to exactly where it's being constructed, right? So in this particular case, we're not going to be talking about oppositional pieces between specific words. What we're more focused and intently kind of trying to analyze is that this word means this, and there's many ways to be able to demonstrate that. We could either show somebody and not say it in English, we could use English, we could show pictures, we could just use repetition, right? And we could just say it, speak about it, and somebody could naturally pick it up. So some of these are take it or leave it type of concepts. And, again, when we reach those points, take it or leave it. Develop the understanding that you can, but don't get too buried in the fact that you can't. That's basically what it boils down to. There's no expectation to retain all of this. Whatever sticks for you, whatever works for you, by all means, use that as your foundation for linguistics if you plan to use linguistics further. Let's jump ahead to exercise 8 and then 11 and 13. Okay, so we just left on 6, 7.
I think Verina's watching us. Hi, Verina.
Number 6.
Page 6, okay, perfect.
How do you see?
Exercise 8. Now what we're doing, this can be another tricky piece. And now we're on handout 3, handout 3, page 6, and exercise 8. The exercise, compare these data from DT-dot, Kwakwaka'wakw, Sinchotlan. What similarities and differences do you see? Which similarities are due to genetic relatedness? This is where you were going earlier, right, Vicky?
Yeah.
Which to language contact and which to coincidence? This, first off, we need to stretch our imaginations that there was a parent language that existed a long time ago that all of our other languages have emanated from. The Nuchano, Kwakwaka'wakw, maybe even Haitsla up a little bit further north, and then as we go down the coast, they all originated from this one parent language. We need to first kind of subscribe to that belief in order to do this exercise. That sometimes is not as easy for some learners to do as it is for others, right? So if you're one of the learners that feel like that's not my belief that the language originated in that way, because we have stories about where our language came from and where our dialects came from, and that's what I believe more in, that's perfect. But in this particular exercise, we're going to assume that they all originate from one source, that there was one master language that had originated early on that sort of branched out to all of these different forms of the languages we know today. And so this is challenging because we don't often just immediately seeing these. What Adam will do in the instruction is he'll read these out for us and we'll repeat it. But that is often our first exposure to some of these words and to the writing style and all of those things to do with this. So the expectation to be able to immediately understand and to be able to pull apart differences and similarities isn't as high as it would be if this was a more advanced linguistics course. But basically what we're doing is just trying to use our power of deduction to just look and see for ourselves what kind of similarities pop out for us. We already kind of touched on some of this earlier, and that was the rounded glottalized K in the Kwakwaka'wakw and the DT-dot. So both of the words for snow sound like they have a very common origin. Kwe is a common, all the way from the North Island down to DT-dot, that there's a commonality that's there. There's a very big difference in Sinchotlan in the way that it's written. You'll notice that the orthography that they use is all capitalized letters, and it looks very different than Nuchano. So it's hard to compare the written form of that language with the other ones. So then we move a line down or 2 lines down, and let's look at the interlinear translation. We see that it says read the sea urchin is the interlinear translation on line 3 under the Sinchotlan. We move over to compare it to the DT-dot. Red is sea urchin the. The order is almost the same. The placement of the is slightly different, but for the large part, the order of the sentence structure is similar. Even though we didn't know what these words were or mean, we can look at these interlinear analysis and determine that the syntax or sentence structure is fairly similar to one another. Now, trying to determine the three parts of genetic relatedness or contact or coincidence is really a hypothetical approach for you. There's no real clear set in stone that these are either one of those three. Again, you need to subscribe to the belief first in the Proto-Waukeshan language, which is a stretch sometimes. You also need to make the assumption based upon data that you receive, and this is a small amount of data to go over. Usually, if you were trying to make those kind of assumptions, you would go over as much information as you can. We would try to find as many words as possible that started with "quit" for snow, and looking at the different languages and how they're connected and what the stories around those were and how it might have possibly come through because of intermarriage up and down the coast, or how a big event had occurred and everybody was impacted by it and it impacted our language and our communication. So those, or was it just strictly coincidence that, you know, we have similar sounds in our language here as people do in Africa or Europe, and those are coincidental. There was no close proximity, there was no genetic similarities, there was no contact with each other, but still we have the same sounds, right? One of those coincidence pieces that always comes to mind for me is the kind of ma sound, ma, for mama, for mother. It's almost in many, many languages across the world, ma, mom, om, right? You get that, the same sounds to represent the same type of a thing.
That's
So-
the same noise a baby makes,
Yeah.
that's the first noise.
Right. So those are probably more based on
Right.
coincidence, because it's a natural part of being a human being, regardless of where we're from,
Yeah.
regardless of our genetics, regardless of any of those things. Humans behave in a similar fashion no matter where you are. Those are coincidence, right? Or we might not even call them coincidence if we look at it in that context. We might just call it human, natural human characteristic, right? The genetics is more about the way that for thousands of years, my ancestors have spoken in a way that structured my throat and my mouth in a certain way to make those types of sounds. And it's going to be more natural to me as a result, because I'm born through thousands of years and generations of people who led up to my birth, right? And that's a part genetically of who I am. The contact is like, my grandparents were from different areas. My grandmother spoke a different language, but when they came together, we kind of got a mixed version. And then I've learned to say these things through contact with one another. Or maybe we had a nation down the island that we traded with consistently for a lot of time, and we had a really good, peaceful sort of arrangement with them. And we were always talking to each other, but we spoke different languages or dialects, but they eventually started to blend a bit. Then we can start to see that when we analyze a whole bunch of data. So that's what these exercises are focusing on, just getting you to think along those lines. Again, there's a lot of assumptions that are made. We're learning these things for the first time. So the expectation is not to get it exactly right, because in this particular case, there is no exactly correct answer. If you argue your own perspective and your understanding of it, that's what we're looking for.
That you're applying the knowledge
Yeah.
that you've acquired. It's not so much of being right, but it's
That's
about
right.
seeing the problem and explaining your way through it,
And-
showing your work.
And rightness will come more from having more data to analyze, right? The more words that we can relate to these and draw as comparison or contrasting to it, then we can start to make an even more educated assumption on this. And so that's
I like
essentially
that.
what we're doing, right?
Educated assumption.
Yeah.
I like that.
That's good.
There was a really neat, not quite matching this, but Timmy, when he was down at that talk down at the university down there,
Oh,
they
yeah.
had this talk about collecting natural plants, and the one was all these trees they planted in their garden, and all the trees, had an ending that was exactly the same,
Oh, yeah.
except the cedar tree, but all the rest were all the same, just like here.
Right, yeah.
Even though it was different, it was exactly the same. So you felt this light of connection,
go.
like this.
So then in this exercise, what the question would be putting is, do you think that those similarities that you recognized in the language down around the Seattle area, that you recognized that there was a common sort of piece to our language, which was that plant names will have a certain suffix to indicate that it's a plant, but there are some plants that are unique and don't carry that same pattern or that system, like cedar. So do you think that that was through contact, that we had been in close contact with each other for a long time? Do you think that it's something that's genetic, that it's just because we live in a very similar geographical region and we've just developed those naturally? Or do you think it's just purely coincidental, that it just happens to be like that?
I can't imagine it was.
Yeah.
I can't imagine it just happened.
Yeah, so see, then we have to just make an assumption, because we don't have enough data to draw upon. What if we went a little further down the coast and found out that they do the exact same thing, but they have some teachings that explain a little bit deeper as to why they do it?
Yeah.
Then maybe we could start to unearth that, okay, this is probably why we do that too, and we learned it from them, or they learned it from us. Then that's contact. But so that's why we need more data, but you're naturally picking out those pieces yourself and understanding the similarities, and that's a really big important piece. So that's what we're trying to do here, is trying to draw out those and elaborate on it more, right? We move to the last page of this. This is page 8, handout 4, and it's exercises 11, 12, and 13. These are looking at different language acquisition and language learning approaches, each of these questions. So the first one is, which of these language learning strategies are immersion strategies, and which ones imitate the pattern of natural L1 acquisition? First off, let's look at another way to phrase those questions. Which of these language learning strategies are immersion strategies? Well, that's a difficult question to answer if we're not directly engaged with all of or any of these approaches, because when we look at it on the onset, ideally, all of these could or should be immersion. If we subscribe to the belief that immersion is going to help to fast track and accelerate our learning experience to get us to fluency, then we could or should make each of these immersive approaches. But some of these are designed with immersion more fully in mind. The natural approach can include immersion, but isn't necessarily. It doesn't list in the description that remaining in the language is a key component to that approach. But what it does identify for the natural approach is the importance of making new learners feel comfortable and backtracking to almost childlike stage of learning to be able to ease into the learning process and not dive into some of the more harder, substantial pieces. So the immersion piece could fit in there, but isn't an integral part of it. With total physical response, again, this is ideally something that is completely facilitated in language with no English or no other language. And if it's done in that way, it is immersive. But quite often what we see is something different. We see some words being used in the language, but also English sprinkled in to help to elaborate or to set it up or to those types of things. So if that's the case, that's not immersive. The language nest in its ideal form is immersive. It's a space where children will be dropped off, and as soon as they enter into the space, they're spoken to in the language, they're greeted in the language, they're expected to speak the language, and there's that expectation and that opportunity is placed there for the whole duration of being in that space. The language nest is an example of an immersive technique, if it's applied correctly. The mentor-apprentice approach, again, is one of those that ideally would be an immersive approach, but it's kind of based upon your own organic way of approaching it. If you, like with the Mentor Apprentice program, when I took it, the onus was on the learner to set the scheduling, to set up all those pieces, and we were learning those parts for the first time and didn't really know what we were doing. So some of our learners and mentors really struggled because there wasn't something structured time-wise or any of those, and we had to come up with all of those structures and schedules ourselves and work those out with one another. And so in my example with Auntie Julia and Uncle Simon, I would sit with them at their home or in different places that we go to, and we would stay in the language. And I would document how many hours that we spent staying in the language with one another. In other cases, it might be different. So that one's a little harder, right? Ideally, mentor-apprentice is immersion, but it doesn't always, because sometimes learners will revert to English because that's a natural thing to occur in our learning. We might have a speaker who wants you to understand the deeper meaning of the word and will explain to it in more detail in English. And that's very common with our speakers. Very seldomly do we have speakers who will fully stay in the language no matter what. But the more that we have of those, the better, because then we naturally have to pick up those pieces ourselves. The accelerated second language acquisition is geared towards adult learners. So it's not really an immersive technique necessarily either. You could, to certain degrees, have immersion included within it, but since you're dealing with adult learners and you're trying to fast track and get into building sentences and saying sentences right away, it's usually comparing English sentences with neutralal sentences and saying, this is how you say this, and really quickly memorizing and piecing together short sentences. So that one isn't necessarily immersive in its full approach, but it could be, depending on who's applying and facilitating that approach. And the shared stories method has elements of being immersive, where we will take time to sit with speakers and elders and only be in the language to talk about the stories, but there's time before and time after where English is incorporated. So basically, if English is incorporated into the learning style, it's not immersive. But if it's only in the target language, in our case, if it's strictly in neutralal, then it's full immersion. And that's, to me, that's ideal. If we can start to see more and more of those types of initiatives of full immersion coming into play, we're going to start seeing more and more fluent speakers being developed as a result. Sadly, throughout a lot of the rest of the country and the other places that I've gone to, even in other places, we're not quite at those places of full immersion and full fluency being developed in any of these places. I think that we have a lot of potential here because we have some very dedicated and committed people and families who work outside of the school system or within it and outside or within organized entities that are out there and are just making this happen because it's important and because it needs to. And that's where we see immersion really start to flourish. Okay, so exercise 12, when learning a language, is it helpful to read and write? And the follow-up question to that is why? Again, there could be a mixture of responses to this. It's up to you, your own thoughts and beliefs around it. I have my own. You'll have your own. There's no right or wrong answer with this particular exercise. Exercise 13 is similar. When learning a language, is it helpful to have a conscious understanding of the grammar? How about when teaching a language, and why? Well, this is a little bit more pointed because it's starting to bring in the aspect of teaching a language to other people, and it might make us start thinking that, okay, it is important to understand grammar because if we're trying to explain it to somebody else, we need to be able to break it down to more simplistic, more swallowable pieces, right? Like we don't,
especially if you're working with a language learner that's an adult.
Yeah, right. So it depends.
Well, it's like knowing how to use a knife, but not knowing how to make a knife. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a point where if you're really totally into knives and you want to be a knife teacher, you want to know how to make knives
Right.
and you can answer those questions.
That's
but
right.
anyone can probably speak English and not know a single thing about how to set up a sentence.
Yeah.
But once you figure out how to set up a sentence, you're almost lethal.
Yeah.
And that's just the difference in a way.
There you go. That's a very good analogy. And so with our language, there could be learners who can learn and become fluent in the language, but not know how to break it apart or not know even how to write it or read it, right? And that's perfectly fine. If that's what the outcome is that you want to achieve, is just to be able to speak the language, you can understand it. It doesn't, like, you're going to still understand it. But if your intention is to teach other people, especially if your intention is to teach other people to teach, that's even a different layer of dynamics involved in that. Then you're going to be teaching a very specific, highly motivated group of learners that are likely going to be adults who are going to be wanting to fast track those pieces, and they're going to require it to be broken down in that specific way, like you're saying, right? If you're teaching a group of children from a very early age, you might be able to bypass that and not have to use grammar as much, and that just becomes more naturally involved in their learning approach, right? So again, these questions, there's no right or wrong answer with these ones specifically, so it's whatever you feel. And it's more of helping to draw those out, to articulate your own understanding of why linguistics.
How you're going to use it.
Yeah, exactly.
In saying that though, I think it's really important to teach youth the building blocks, because I think same thing, it's a lot harder when you're older.
Right. I agree. Those are the excellent points as part of a response to exercise 13. None of what we shared there would be wrong. And anything that we have to share as an opinion on it comes from us, from our own understanding of our own experience and approaches or ideas. And that's essentially what we're trying to explore a little further with that.
You're making me excited to actually do my homework.
Okay, good. That's my job. Adams is the opposite, apparently. Just kidding. Okay. Exercises 14 to 17 are next on the list. And this looks like it brings us to pages 11. Sorry, get confused here. No, sorry, page 9. Page 9 to 11. So let's start with exercise 14. So this handout is on vowels. And the exercise 14 asks, which English vowels are diphthongs and which are monophthongs? Well, all the English vowels are listed right above that exercise, and there's a very quick and simple way to be able to determine which English vowels are diphthongs and which English vowels are monophthongs. The way that we can see, because they're written in the International Phonetic Alphabet, any of the vowels that have two characters representing the vowel sound are diphthongs, di, meaning two. Any of the vowels that are represented by one character in the International Phonetic Alphabet are monophthongs. So let's look at the list. Beat, spelled phonetically with International Phonetics, is B, lowercase I, T. There's only one character representing the E sound, so that's a monophthong. It's only one character in an International Phonetic Alphabet. Let's move over to the other side of the columns. The word for boy is represented in International Phonetic Alphabet as B, O, capital I. So now we see that there's two vowels that are blending there. That makes that a diphthong. That means that there's two vowel sounds that are contained within that one vowel. Does that make sense? It's easy to distinguish on this list which is a monophthong and which is a diphthong by looking at the International Phonetic spelling for each word. If you see only one vowel character in that word, only one meaning mono, then it's a monophthong. If you see two vowel characters represented in that word, that vowel is a diphthong.
And just being, sorry, you go ahead first.
This funny one that looks like the A and the E stacked together.
Right.
I put that as a monophthong.
It is.
Yeah, you're right. It's just a weird character,
It's
but it
squished
is
together.
one character, right?
There's one.
Yeah.
Because it's got one sound.
Yes.
And another way to do that is not only by appearance, but by sound.
Okay.
So if you were unsure and you weren't too sure if that was supposed to be a monophthong or a diphthong, we're looking at the word bat on example number 2 on page number 9 of handout 5. And we're looking at the word bat. And the International Phonetic Alphabet symbol for that vowel sound is like a blending of an A and an E, a lowercase A and E squished together. So look at the word. The word is bat. Let's isolate just the vowel sound, ah. Do we hear another vowel sound in there? No, we don't. Ah is only one vowel sound throughout from the beginning to the end. Ah.
Like A.
Not like A, where we get the A, E, kind of an
Yeah.
it in there too. So this is only one vowel sound. That's another way of just listening phonetically for monophthongs. Again, it's easier in your channels because that's all that we have. We only have monophthongs.
Oh,
Phonologically, we only have monophthongs. And there are no vowels blended. If two different vowel sounds end up next to each other, there's always going to be a glottal stop separating them. They're never blended together. So if we're writing something out and we see two vowels together, we made a mistake. There should be at least a glottal in there to separate them, and a glottal acts like a consonant. Glottals are in English, but we just don't hear them, and we don't write them out in English. But you do hear it. Phonetically, you hear glottals in English through different accents and different pronunciations. Some people say battery, but some people will glottalize it and make it like battery. You hear that pause in between? It's separating those two vowel sounds, ah and eh, from one another, battery. So it's not just blended together. And so that's an example of a glottal in English, but the glottals in Channel are way easier when we're reading it because it's always represented by the glottal stop, right? So when a word starts with a vowel, it has a glottal before it. When two vowels in a word are close to each other, one after the other, there's going to be a glottal in between it. Or na'ata, na'ata. See, the and are separated from one another with a glottal. Na-a-ta.
Ha-ah.
Yeah, there's a little pause in there that separates those two vowels so that
So it's not just
they both
ha.
remain. That's how we say it. But what it does is it emphasizes the importance that all of our vowels are monophthongs. That it's not so much about the quantity, the number of vowels like English, but it's the quality of the vowel. So the length of the vowel is important, right? So we don't want to blend them together too much if we don't have to, especially when they're different vowel sounds. Our language doesn't like to do that. So the way that this list lays it out really easily for us for the English vowels. And so the simple way of looking at it and reading it is if it's represented by one character in the International Phonetic Alphabet, it's a monophthong. If it's represented by two vowel characters in the International Phonetic Alphabet, it is a diphthong. Okay? Next exercise is number 15, right underneath that one on page 9. And this asks you to transcribe the vowels in these English words using the IPA symbols. This is an exercise that is more about you training your own ear. And we hear some words differently. And what I often find when I'm marking these papers is the word for war, right? War.
Blew my mind.
Yeah.
Still don't know what it sounds
Some
like.
people hear it as war, as in like the word or, right? Or some people hear it as more of a rounded, like a war, or. So there could be a slight difference. But basically what you're going to do in this exercise is you're going to look at the word. In this case, the first one is buzz. You're looking at just the vowel sound. So let's listen to buzz and try to pull out just the vowel sound in there. Right? It sounds kind of like to me. Buzz. So let's look at the lists up here. Which one sounds most similar? Beat doesn't, bit doesn't, bait doesn't, bet doesn't. Abba, no. Bat, no, we're looking more for boot, no, that's too hard. Ooh, book, book. Close, but there, that to me sounds like the one. But. So what was the word? Buzz and but. Let's keep the B. But, buzz. Sounds very similar to me. So there's the character that we're looking for. It's like a capital A without the cross piece inside of it. And that represents the sound in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So for this exercise, we could just write buzz and write it with that phonetic vowel character in it, or just put it beside it, whichever way you want. I'm okay with it. As long as you can recognize and for yourself, gift. We'll do one more. The second word is gift. So we're looking for the I sound. What character in the International Phonetics represents I?
The small capital I.
Yep. The small, and the example word here is bit, right?
Yep.
Yep. So then we can see that the capital I represents the I sound in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So we would put the capital I with gift, because that's the sound that we hear. And we'll just go through each of those words, referencing this list here, maybe sounding it out ourselves. Some of them will be tricky. Some might sound very similar and we won't know exactly for sure, but that's a good insight for us. There's some sounds that we hear in English that kind of get blended, and it's good for us to know what those sounds are. And this exercise can help with that.
And it's interesting to see what consonants can shape vowels as you're getting into them, similar to like how our pharyngeal can change the sound of vowels when it's close to something, because it drags it down for how low it starts off, right?
Right. Perfect. We flip the page to page 10, same handout, and now we're looking at exercise 16, and it asks you to transcribe the vowels in these neutronal words using IPA symbols. So it's essentially asking you to do the exact same thing, but now you have neutronal words instead of English words. Neutronal words, if we know how to pronounce it according to neutronal phonetics, then we can find the right sound. If we don't know neutronal phonetics yet, this exercise can be tricky because we might pronounce it like English, but that's not how it's pronounced in neutronal, right? For example, if you're looking at the first word on example 7 on page 10, the first word is put, but you might read that with an English way of speaking as pat, right? So what we're doing is we're reading neutronal phonetics, not English. So we need to distinguish that difference first. Then, once you have the pronunciation of the neutronal vowel sounds, you want to replace those vowels with those same characters that we were referencing on that list there. It's cross-referencing to that list with each word.
Well,
Right.
now I know why there were people in class going like this back and forth. They're like, do you have another copy of this picture? I said, no, just take a picture of it.
So for those of you who haven't done that handout yet, it's a lengthy list, and you could, one option is that you just write it on next to the page and just hand in the page to me if that's what you prefer to do, or write out the list and put the International Phonetic Alphabet symbol next to the word You definitely do not need to put the translation, the English translation of the words, if you're listing these out for me. All that I want to see is that you're getting those symbols and replacing it. And this isn't something that's going to be necessary for most of us. Again, this is more for specialized for people who might aspire to be language teachers, right? More specifically, people who want, to cross-reference to the International Phonetic Alphabet and go into that. We never write in international phonetics in our language today, and I don't know of anybody that does. So therefore, it's almost irrelevant, but it's good to know because it really helps us understand the vowel sounds ourselves and how we hear it, right? And that's, if anything, that's the most important takeaway that I see from it. Okay, now that was exercise 16 on page 10. We're going to flip over 11. We're into handout 6 and move to page 12. Page 12. Bottom of page 12, handout 6, is exercise 17. And this one asks for each consonant at the beginning of a neutronic word in example 1, identify the consonant's place, manner, and phonation. So we need to backtrack one page to example 1, and you'll see that it lists manner, English examples, and neutronic examples. This is helpful for us when we're categorizing just the manner of each of these words because it already tells us what they are. So it's already giving us the manner for these neutronic words. Poo is a borrowed word that we use for gun. So the p, we're looking only at consonants here, right? We're not looking at vowels anymore in this handout. So the p, the plain p, the manner is called a stop. So we can just take note of that, stop. So is a glottal t, oos, the is the manner of it is a stop, meaning that it's the vocal cords that are stopping the air for a second, and then it's allowing a much more, sort of a harder burst of air to come out. So when we're glottalizing our consonants, we want it to we call it explosive or popping. But basically what we're doing is we're constricting the vocal cords to stop the air for a second, and then it lets it out in a burst. And that's why it's called a stop. That's why the manner is called stop. Is that you can even feel it. If you put your hand on your throat and you do the glottal T, you feel your throat moving and tensing, but do a plain T and it's tuh, tuh. And it's not constricting and stopping that airflow quite as much, right? There, the glottal P really stops it. And so the manner is called stop. These other words underneath, so that you look, the S sound, just a plain S, the wedged S, the sh, the th, and the these are all called fricatives, and all of each of these are described in greater detail up here. So we could see that a stop, it's also called a plosive. It involves total obstruction of the vocal cords, followed by a noisy release as a stop. A fricative is also known as aspirant, and it involves continuous noisy air flow through an obstruction. So what we're doing is we're just opening the pathway just a little bit and letting that air out. We're not stopping it completely, but we're not opening it wide either. It's somewhere in between. Affricates are different. Affricates are begin as a plosive, then it's released into aspirant. So remember, a plosive has a hard obstruction, and then it's partially obstructed in the vocal cords. When we're talking about obstruction, we're talking about the vocal cords either being wide open, like that, that's wide open, or like that, where it's vibrating a little bit, or stopping it, and we're just stopping it and then letting the air out explosively. So that's what we're doing. We're stopping it, and then we're letting it wide open. Stopping those vocal cords and then letting it wide open. Or sometimes we stop it and we let it partially open. And that's what this is describing. So that's one way for us to look at it. Instead of stop and fricative and aspirant, just think of what your vocal cords are doing while you're making the sounds. Knowing that those hard sounds that let out a lot of air all at once are being caused from a stop or the closure of the vocal cords. The vibrating sounds are when the vocal cords are partially open. And the wide open sounds like come from when the vocal cords are wide open and just air is free to pass through. So basically, what's happening with the air from the lungs? Is it being stopped first? Is it going through a small opening and vibrating, or is it wide open? Is basically what it's asking here.
So on to answer that, then should we write out each of these Newtonic words?
If you write out each of the Newtonic words that are Newtonic examples on example 1,
Yeah.
that starts you off on your column, and then you already have the manner of each of them. So
Yeah,
all you need to
okay.
find is the place and the phonation that is attached to each of them. And that's what I'll talk about next. The place is really what we talked about earlier. Does it emanate from the lips? Does it emanate from the teeth? From the tongue in the teeth, in between the teeth, the tongue behind the teeth, the tongue up on the top of the roof of the mouth in the front, the hard palate, the soft palate, the uvula,
Okay.
back into the throat, down here to the pharynx. So that's what the place is asking. The manner is what the air is doing with the vocal cords, and there's 3 main types, right? We can look at it in the linguistic terms, or just think of it as closed, partially open, and open.
So what
Right.
they're asking for is, what is your vocal cords doing?
Yep.
Where are you making the sound in your mouth?
Yep.
And then what's the last one?
Phonation.
I've already forgotten phonation.
It says here consonant phonation, what the vocal folds are doing during a consonant specifically. Consonant manner, how airflow is used during a consonant, and consonant place, where in the vocal tract a consonant is made. So the airflow is the part that the vocal cords and that the lungs are letting out. So the vocal cords can stop that airflow. It can partially let air through, or it can let air all the way through. But what are the vocal cords doing themselves? Are they vibrating?
Oh,
Are they
okay.
still? Are they stiff? Are they, when they're wide open, are they vibrating? That's what phonation is.
That blew my mind.
Yeah.
Oh.
That was a fun course. I
Yeah.
remember going home going, whoa.
Yeah.
And then making noises, just going, whoa.
So you can identify these different pieces of where the place is very easily on your own. You can do sound. You can go through the whole alphabet and feel yourself where each of these sounds are coming from and label it and identify it for yourself. This feels like it's coming from this part of my mouth. Linguists have already done that, and they have a very linguist, jargony type of way of identifying each of those spots that they are all familiar with, and you could mention any one of these to a linguist, and they could immediately be able to understand where the formation or construction of that vowel sound or the consonant sound comes from by identifying these places.
Tools to talk about the language, talking
Right.
about.
And I personally, I like the more simplistic language that we use on a regular basis. Like if I was talking to my children, I wouldn't say that it's a bilabial fricative, right? That doesn't make sense. I would say that it comes from the lips. So you purse your lips together, puh, 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 right? And you think of other sounds that start with that. It comes from the teeth. So you're going to use like these sounds here with your teeth. Even the word teeth uses the teeth in it, right? The L. Remember, we used the L for the barred L, but we used a plain L like in English to find the placement of the tongue. The tip of the tongue goes up to the hard palate, L at the end of the L sound, L. But then what we're going to do, we'll keep that tongue up at the top of the mouth at the front, and then let air out, right? So we're talking about place and manner and phonation when we talk about it naturally like that too. But this is another way to do it that helps to break it down in a linguistic term, right? Mm-hmm. So it's there for you to play with. If some people take to it, some people don't. But understanding where the consonants are formed in the mouth is helpful, right? Because when we know when we're not doing it right. And basically, our habit from English speaking moving to Newtonal speaking is that we don't have the structure and the muscles yet to make those sounds properly. We might be able to make it in isolation. We might be able to just say "cla," right? "Cla," or we could glottalize it by itself, "cla," right? But when we're saying it and slipping it into a whole word, we might lose that ability. That's why it's really important for us to be mindful of where it's supposed to come from and how they interact with each other. Just like you're saying, a back age will distort a vowel sound after it, where if it was
BQ yelling.
Yeah.
Well, I still don't know how to actually pronounce the pharyngeal, but I know where I'm supposed to make it.
Yeah. And so sometimes what we do with a pharyngeal, especially if it's distorting a vowel sound, is we will replace, instead of thinking like a pharyngeal I, instead of thinking of that I like we normally would, I or I, then we just think and replace it with the English sound I. And that's where we get confused with like Wykosh, right? And those types of things, because we think it's an I sound like in English. But English is wrong. I isn't that sound. I should make an I or I sound, according to International Phonetic Alphabet. English uses it to represent I.
Well, and
right?
that's how Huayet is
Yeah.
pronounced differently, because it's not actually Huayet.
Yeah.
There's a pharyngeal
Yeah.
in it, and it's a double
Huayet.
I.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
but it distorts it, so when
Right.
it's written in an anglicized way, they put A,
Yeah.
because that's easier.
And that's what we'll experience even more of when we're reliant on audio recordings and things and we're documenting and writing it out. We'll start to spell those things wrong, and inadvertently we'll start putting something else down instead of what is actually being said, right? So that's why it's important for us to understand those differences.
Yeah, transcribing, like if you've got old tape and
Mhm.
stuff, if you start writing, trying to write them out, I was trying to do that this weekend too. Is write out a piece, and then I had to have corrected it on all my vowels, basically all my vowels were wrong. Because I heard different vowels in different words.
There is different resources that will help us identify these easier. They're already listed out. In some cases, I think it might be listed out in that book somewhere as part of the glossary too, that tells you all the different parts and the linguistic jargon of where that sound originates, what kind of manner, what kind of place in those things. I know that the Nootka texts have one of those sheets in it too that already has it listed out. So we have reference sheets that, we don't have to fully rely on our memory to exactly remember all these terms. It's nice if you do grasp it, but don't get overwhelmed if you don't, because there are references that are out there that we can just use as a sheet. It's already there that shows us the whole alphabet that we have and all the sounds that we have and where they come from when we're constructing it. So it's good to know it, but it's also there available for us to rely on when we need to at any other time too. Okay, next we're going to look at exercises 19 to 26. No, 20. 19 to 20. And I think we're jumping ahead now to a different handout. No?
IPA, why is
Oh,
it?
yeah, handout 7.
Handout 7 now.
Page 14.
Perfect. So now we're going to look at exercises 19 and 20, and this is on the alphabets. The first question, for exercise 19 is, why isn't IPA used to write Neutrano? Again, fairly open-ended question, not a very specific yes or no type of an answer. There's nothing completely correct or incorrect in this term. As long as you're putting your effort forward and applying some of what you've been learning into this response, that's essentially what we're looking for. So the question is asking, the International Phonetic Alphabet, and what we've started to recognize is that it has some very curious looking symbols that aren't recognizable or used on a daily basis. Well, there's one reason that it might not be used by us regularly is because the characters are so bizarre looking and not used, not as familiar as English letters are or whatever. The other thing is that perhaps we don't use this because these fonts aren't as readily available for us, and we want to be able to write and create resources, and we want to be able to use things that are more accessible. And so this was more so the case earlier on when people were using typewriters before computers and coming up with an orthography that the typewriter could do. So Senchoffen was an example of using the typewriter, the availability and accessibility of a typewriter and what it was capable of doing to be able to articulate your language. And so the International Phonetic Alphabet couldn't have been used because there were special characters that are hard to use as font, right? So there's another reason that we might not use the International Phonetic Alphabet. Another reason could be if we knew a little bit more personally the people that were involved in the construction of the International Phonetic Alphabet and realized and appreciated that they modeled it after the American model and it was much different, then we might be able to articulate that, and that could be a response. There's a number of different responses to this question. Basically just looking for your level of understanding as it started to develop by this point. Exercise number 20. It brings us to page, same page. Just further down, exercise 20. These transcriptions are from the rival whalers. Superior 1924. Transliterate each word into the Neutronal alphabet and give an English translation. This exercise is another one of those cross-reference exercises. If you go back a page, you'll notice that there's 3 columns, 3 rows, Neutronal, International Phonetic Alphabet, and the rival whalers. Each of the 3 are different from one another. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at the word as it's spelt in the rival whalers text, and we can see that there's a TC combination that starts there. So we can look and look under the rival whalers. It's the third row down. There's 2 separate columns, so it's the 3rd row on each of them. So we can see that the TC combination when we find it on here, translates into a wedged C in modern New Channel phonetics. So we're going to replace that TC with a wedged C, and the A is still the short A is still a short A in New Channel phonetics. The K is still the same. The O has become a U, and the P is the same. So then we can see that in modern New Channel phonetics, it looks like wedged C, plain A, or short A, plain K, short U, plain P.
What's that little?
There's weird little diacritics that are on there that look like apostrophes before some.
Yeah.
What you'll notice is that some of the characters on the rival whalers include that. So you'll see some of the characters like the T, apostrophe S becomes a glottalized C.
Okay.
The T apostrophe C becomes a glottalized wedged C. So sometimes those diacritics that look like an apostrophe up top represent a glottalization.
Oh, yeah, okay.
If they're facing a certain way. If they don't seem to make any sense at all, it's because there was a little piece that the authors of the rival whalers had in their own writing style that no longer carries over into the modern way of writing our language. And so it is a little confusing. It's one of those things that is becoming obsolete. It was only a very special select text that was written in this format that's already translated into modern New Channel. So unless we want to go through that and learn how to do that ourselves for fun, it's kind of becoming irrelevant in the sense that it's already been done and we don't necessarily have to do that ourselves. It's just more, it's an exercise to understand that there was earlier forms of writing our language that are no longer used. And so sometimes we come across those historical ways that were used to write our language in the early stages, and we want to convert it into modern New Channel, right?
Okay.
That way it becomes more universally understandable by our learners today.
Was this Boaz who wrote this?
Yeah, I think it was Boaz who wrote the rival whalers.
It's right here.
Was it Sapir?
Sapir.
Oh yeah, Boaz spent more time a little further north. Sapir in 1924.
Did you guys get one of these handouts?
Yes.
So it just asks you, it gives you a list of words. So ideally there is correct answers for this exercise because there is a correct way to spell these in modern New Channel phonetics. So the words that we have here, just quickly looking, Chaco, Ihtu, Yukwa, Impi, Tuchziti, Klupchik, Hinip, Sukwik, Klutzmei, Usunch, and Oi, right? Those are the words. So if we know what those words are, we can start to figure out how to convert it from the old way of writing the rival whalers to the modern New Channel phonetic alphabet. And that can be useful to get a better understanding of the sounds and the modern New Channel phonetic alphabet also.
Okay, so
Right.
to answer this one, we could just do the phonetic, the modern way. We don't need to write down this other piece.
No, and if you can identify what the word is supposed to be and you know how it's supposed to be spelled, you can fast track that and just like, oh, that word is supposed to be Chakup, and this is how Chakup is spelled. So there, you're done. Ehtup is another one that we use quite often, right? That we hear quite often. So it's just a quick conversion because sometimes we do go over old texts and we see it written in a really weird way, right? I've gone through, I've transcribed quite a few of them.
Transliterated.
Yeah. Haven't done that quite yet.
No?
I've set
Isn't
it
that
up.
what that is when you go from one system to another?
No. Well, transcribing is taking and just writing it down.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I've done.
But that's the activity that
Yeah,
you're doing.
that's what you guys are gonna do. Yep,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
So that's that exercise. It's there to help you to transliterate from the rival whalers format of writing to a modern New Channel phonetic style of writing. If anything, it can help you to solidify your understanding of modern New Channel phonetics. That finished us off with exercise 20, which means we jump to exercises 23 and 24.
Page 16.
Sorry, page 16?
Yeah.
Nice, thanks. Okay, exercise 23 asks, in most North American English dialects, T and D alternate with a sound, and then it's got a symbol, which is called a flap. how many phonemes do T, D, and its flap represent? So T and D, let's think of English. There is some examples here, I think. Well, in some cases in English, the T can be pronounced and it sounds like a D, right? When we say, I think one of the examples that Adam used was betting or betting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Some people will say betting, but that sounds like what you put onto a bed, like sheets and linen.
Yeah, you can be betting at a poker table, or you can be putting the betting on.
And that is an example of a flap. So that's the flexibility of that consonant T to sound like T or D, right? It can be soft or it can be hard, but it's not changing the meaning of the word. It means the same thing, but it's pronounced slightly differently. That's the flap, right? So this exercise is asking you specifically about the TD, the flap between the T and the D. And again, it's asking how many phonemes do T, D, and the flap represent? Well, in this case, the T and the D make a different word. So those are separate phonemes. But if it's flapped and the T sounds like a D, but it still means the same thing, then that doesn't count as a phoneme because it still means the same thing, right? So
Like paddle,
that or battery might be a good word because some people it sounds like a D sound in there, but some will say battery. Some might even skip it all out completely and say battery, right? And not even have the T or D sound in it. But the word is the same, no matter what. It still means the same thing. Battery, and battery all mean the exact same thing, right? But there's 3 different phonemes, 3 different sounds, but they mean the same thing. So it gets a little bit confusing, right? A phoneme is the sound that we hear, but a morpheme is the meaningful part. So
I didn't even know I was hearing a different sound.
Right.
I thought it was just 2. I was like, yeah, no, there's 2. There's battery and no, there's 3. That's a totally different sound. Yeah. And it blew my freaking mind.
I had an interesting conversation with everybody in my house, and I'm the only one that says grocery store, and everybody else says grocery store, right? And then that's another example, and we've got a lot of those that we started to explore. And I have a tendency of overly pronouncing words because when I was young, both my parents didn't speak English to start with. My mother didn't start to really speak English. She spoke Nuu-chah-nulth until she was about 10, 11, 12. Strong Nuu-chah-nulth accent in her English as a result, especially in this flap between the T, D sound and those things, right? She'll say dop instead of top. She'll say bick instead of pick, right? She'll have a hard time distinguishing between the P and B and the T and D. And we'd always have fun with it growing up. My dad was different. He was from Finland, and he had a hard time with English and would always make mistakes. As a young child, I adopted that from them, making the mistakes. And so at school, it was almost like I was punished for it. I got so intensely given extra work to correct my pronunciation that they did such a good job that I couldn't pronounce the way that my mother did before, which I wish that I could, because that was more Nuu-chah-nulth, right? So now when I speak with pathologists, with speech pathologists, and they're trying to figure out how they can be more effective with our children, I tell them, don't. Why bother changing them? Let them learn to speak in the way that our ancestors did and just naturally speak and encourage that and celebrate it as opposed to try to correct it and change it, right? I went through that myself, so it's easier to understand. But essentially that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at those types of differences in those sounds and how, even though it sometimes sounds different, the phoneme is different, it sounds different, it means the same thing.
But that's what it is. It's the phoneme is what does it sound like versus what does it mean.
Yeah.
So there would be 3 phonemes in that one, even though it's
You're right.
only 2 meanings.
Yes.
Ah.
Yes, you got it.
I got it.
There can be multiple phonemes.
But a flap is a phoneme, but it's done in a way that's different.
And that's exactly why it's represented by that other symbol that looks like a lowercase r, right? Because it is a phoneme. It's a separate standalone sound that doesn't sound the same as the others. So it's going to be treated differently in a certain sense, but it's not changing the meaning of the word, right? So it can be confusing, but I think you guys are getting the grasp of it, right?
Does Nuu-chah-nulth have words spelled differently meaning the same thing like English?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Well, like English has words that spelled differently but sound exactly the same. Does Nuu-chah-nulth have that?
We wouldn't have that because every time that you see the characters in our New Channel phonetic alphabet, they're pronounced exactly the way that you see it. They're very phonetic in that sense. Whereas in English, there's a lot of variations, like PH can make a F sound. We don't have anything like that, where it might be spelled differently, but we pronounce the same. Yeah. If you can pronounce every one of those characters in the New Channel phonetic alphabet, you can read it, even if you have to pronounce it out slowly. You can read it as long as you can pronounce all of those, because it's not going to fool you and not going to have changes like that. You might hear slight variations in vowel sounds, especially being distorted by further down the throat consonants before it. But that's about the extent of the variation that will be there. Nothing really going to jump out and fool you. It's going to follow that same format all the time, because writing is newer for us. We have the luxury of making it tailored to our language as opposed to the other way around. Right?
Do you mean like read and read? Like they're spelled the same, but they're pronounced differently? Is that what you were saying?
B and B?
Yeah,
Which one, B, buzzing B and B?
like you have, well, even B and red is kind of goofy too. Red and red.
Yeah.
But if that was,
Like what
if
I
that
was
was
thinking.
pronounced in, like if it was written in Channel, it would be
It would always sound the
totally,
same.
they would look different, right?
Whatever's written in the
Red
channels
color red.
should always sound the same.
Yeah.
There might be some slight dialect differences around it or those pieces. For example, idiolect. For example, some speakers tend to use the I sound for a short I more often. Some will say E, and it sounds like an E, right? And that can be confusing to an English ear, because E, well, we're going to automatically think it's a long I, but it doesn't necessarily. If it's just E, then that's a short still. Right? But it's just the idiolect of the speaker that is changing that one sound just a little bit. But it's still a short I represented in our phonetic alphabet. No matter what, it will always be a short I, unless it's E. That's why it's important for us to understand the place and the manner and the construction of those sounds, so that we can feel the difference too. So then we can say the word, like the word is klimaksti, right? That's an example. And at the end, you hear the E. Sometimes when we're starting to learn how to write those words down and we hear that, klimaksti, we would understand that the first short I is a short I, kli, right? Kli. Then ma is a short A, kli, ma, and then sti. That sounds like E, right? So you might put a long I at the end, but it's actually a short I, just pronounced slightly different, right? And that happens sometimes, but not as often as English. It's not going to confuse you.
And that's why it's
Nearly
important
as
to listen
often
to
as
the
English.
length of it.
Timmy used to write, Timmy just listened and he wrote language
Yeah.
when people spoke.
Thanks.
And that's how he wrote it, how he heard it.
Yeah.
And he'd write it, and looking back, it's really cool, because it's written, but it's not at all the same.
Yeah.
And when you first saw the language, it was really daunting, wasn't it? Oh, it's totally lost.
Yeah. It can really throw you back when you've started to develop your own comfort with the language and hearing it the way that you do. Then suddenly you see the way that it's written, and it's way different than what you thought. That threw me off. And I've been really mindful of taking notes. I have big piles of notebooks that I've kept track of for the last 5 years since I started. And when I backtrack, tons of mistakes in my writing that's there, because I tried to sit with elders and I tried to document as much as I could while I was listening to them. They ended up scolding me because I was spending too much time writing the book. But I was writing out as best as I could too, very similarly. And when I backtrack and I look back at some of those earlier words, well, now I can understand that it's not spelled properly, because I was hearing it from an English ear and I was inadvertently adding that into my New Channel writing, right? But it's a good insight to be able to have, because once you start to get a grasp of these concepts of how some slight sound changes might be there, but the writing's always going to be the same. It actually has more of a uniform approach that is more systematic, and that you can apply much easier. Whereas when we just listen with our ear, we're going to hear a whole bunch of different sounds, right? And we're going to be influenced by our English understanding and everything else that's around, or the quality of the audio that we hear might throw things off. If there's background noise, we might not be able to hear some sounds well, right? So there's all sorts of factors that are there. But starting off by practicing on your own is perfect, because then it gives you something to base it on and to compare it to, right? Whereas if you don't have something to compare it to, you're just trying to learn all of this all at once without having anything to compare it to. So I think that that's probably the best approach. is to listen and do your best to try to write what you're hearing based upon your understanding of the pronunciation of the Newtonal phonetic alphabet, and then go through the process of learning where you might have been making mistakes, because then you have that comparable data to be able to analyze it with. Whereas if you only have that, and this is the way that all 46 characters are supposed to sound, and you're supposed to try to get it, then you feel defeated if you don't get it, right? But sometimes you feel defeated if you try and you made mistakes before, but that's part of the natural curve of learning it too. And maybe there's issues with this format of writing that we could make better too, right? But I always think about that. I don't like the fact that they're so English oriented, a lot of these letters. I think it would be amazing if we had all of our own characters that represented all of our own sounds, but that's something that, you know, maybe further down the road eventually could be developed. But we're using and borrowing a lot of English pieces in order to understand our language. So English is always going to infiltrate and disrupt things from time to time because it's so deeply ingrained in our minds, and it's also influencing the alphabet that we use. So it's hard to distinguish sometimes, you know, like how is a glottal N supposed to be different than a plain N? Or how is the U different than the U that I'm so familiar with in English, right? The U could have different sounds in English, but in Newtonal, it should always pretty much sound the same. And if we can ingrain that more in our minds as learners and speakers, if we're using the writing piece of our language, we're going to have our own idiolect when it comes to how we pronounce all of those characters, because we've had to go through our own experience of restructuring our mouth to make those sounds, and it's not going to sound exactly the same. We have different pitches of voice. Some people have lisps, and some people, you know, are missing all their teeth. So, you know, there's going to be different sounds to these different characters, right?
I like our characters more now.
Yeah.
After doing a lot of this, looking through the homework and having to analyze English.
Mm-hmm.
The rules of ours are so much easier.
Yeah.
I was saying, like, listening to a fisherman versus listening to a logger. You know, a fisherman can drag it out.
Yeah.
Whereas a logger come or blunt with shit done.
Yeah.
We're almost there, you guys. We're almost
We're
there.
close. We're close.
What are we on? 24.
No, we just finished exercise 24.
Nope, we did
Did we?
23.
Oh, okay, sorry. Exercise 24 is the phonemes, correct?
Yeah.
That's on page 16. And it's asking, we did touch on this while we went through the overview. That's what happened. So what we see is that the capital I makes the same sound as the long E in Newtonal. So the challenge here is it's asking how many phonemes do the Newtonal vowels I and E represent? It's showing us 3 characters, but there's a duplication here. The capital I makes an E sound. The short I makes the I, and the lowercase I with the 2 dots makes E. So we can hear that the E and the E with the capital I or the I with the 2 dots are the same. In our alphabet, it's actually 2 I's next to each other. So that would have been a better example instead of an I with 2 dots on this exercise. We only have 2 phonemes, 2 sounds. I and E, right? It's a pretty quick. Pardon me?
I'm just reading.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically why they are written as they are, using the concept of
Allophone. If we look back at the terms at the beginning of handout 8, it says allophones, 2 or more sounds that are perceived as the same phoneme. And a phoneme, again, is a sound part of the language. So the 2 phonemes that sound the same in that example are the capital I and the long I. So we only use one, right? We're not using both of them, but they represent the same sound, E. And so however we articulate that, that's one sound, E. There's different ways to write it, but there's one sound, E. I is one sound that's separate from it, and it's represented with just a single plain I. So there's 2 phonemes, I and E. I, E, right? That's the 2 phonemes that we have. It might be represented in many different ways, but it doesn't mean that it has different sounds necessarily.
I answered this wrong in the beginning. I put the capital I and the little I as the I sound.
But I thought we had 3 because it's I, E, and E.
But the E.
The length doesn't, it's not part of this exercise, the length.
Yeah.
It's simply the sound of it and the
Yeah.
shape of it.
Yeah.
Not the length.
Right.
Okay.
So you could add a third phoneme in there, but this exercise doesn't necessarily draw directly on that because as a learner, we might not know that it is sometimes pronounced as I, right, in New Channel, unless we have examples of that, it and I. But E is much longer. So let's look at the examples that are provided on here. Uyi, at the time of. Uyi, give. So what is it changing the meaning is another layer of a question to ask ourselves. If we say uyi, or if we say uyi, very slight difference in that vowel sound, but it's not changing the meaning of the word. But if we change it to uyi, it's changing the meaning of the word. So that's a way for us to be able to tell that they're two separate phonemes because it's changing the meaning also. It's a meaningful sound that's changing something, right? Whereas I and I are so slight and it's not changing the sound, it's not treated the same as I and E, the long ER. That's why in our phonetic alphabet, we only have the two, I and E, because they're meaningful, they can change the meaning of the word, those sounds.
That's right, because I remember asking the question, instead of Pipit's cook, I said, would they understand if I said Pipit's cook?
Yeah.
Because it's, then those phonemes would be interchangeable,
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah.
He said it, yes, but they'd be laughing at you because that's not how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
It's like, it would make sense to them still, but it's
Yeah.
not.
Some elders, it wouldn't still. Right?
it's
Depending on
so
how untrained their ear is to the New Channel language, if they've been exposed to our language for a long time and we use an English borrowed way of saying a word, sometimes to us, we know how it's supposed to be spelled. We're trying to pronounce it properly, but we have such a strong English accent that it's still confusing to elders. And they'll just have a blank look. And that's common. Yeah, it's common. And here in your mind, you think, I thought I had it, right? And it's like, I know how it's spelled. I know it's supposed to be a long vowel, short and short, but still it's not coming out that way. And that's why it is important to be able to practice and know the differences between short and long vowels, especially. So again,
two phonemes.
Quality over quantity with vowels. Yeah, so two phonemes.
Two phonemes, three symbols in this, just to trip you up.
Yeah.
Mess you up with your English
We did
brain.
that earlier, I think, in another exercise too, right?
Yeah.
It catches you, you kind of pick up on that piece.
Make you think.
Understand the difference between a phoneme and a morpheme. Phoneme is the meaningful sound parts of the language. A morpheme is the meaningful written parts of the language, or the meaningful chunks, right?
Yeah.
And then we separate those differently. When we're separating phonemes, we're separating by syllable, right? We're like, so the word for, let's find a syllable that has long, short, like a variation, a longer word. How about, come on, I can think of.
What about like the one for like, do you love me or something?
Oh, yeah, okay, sure. Ya cooks, how about just, I love you.
Okay.
Ya cooks is, or I love, we'll just use that one word so we don't add more into it. Ya cooks, we can hear, or we know when we spell it, yeah, we're getting three syllables, ya cooks, right? And so what we can do is we can understand just by the sound of the phonemes that we have a long vowel, ya, right, ya, then we have uks, those are two short vowel sounds in there. Ya, uks, ya, uks. I'm sorry, I'm using central.
It's okay.
Okay, yeah.
Picking up what you're putting down.
If we added Barkley into it, ya, kwa. So we're adding another short vowel sound at the end. And so in New Channel, we can always separate by phoneme to get the proper rhythm to say the word properly. If when we see a long word written out, we might not know how to properly sound it out. We might say yakuk something and get kind of confused, right? Because we're separating the vowel sounds in the wrong spot. There's a pattern to it that works pretty much all the time. There's only one vowel sound in each syllable in New Channel. And it has one consonant in front of it. Not usually, it always has one consonant in front of it and can have none or one or more consonants following it. So, but it always starts with one consonant, whether it's a glottal or an actual consonant itself. So a word like Einik is as a dog, then we know that it starts with a pharyngeal that acts as a consonant. So I is the first part. Then we need a consonant to start the next syllable. So the next one is N. So I is the first part, then neek is the next syllable, because there's only one vowel sound in that group. So if there's only going to be one vowel sound in each syllable when we're separating it by phoneme. Okay? When we're separating by morpheme, it's going to be different. There could be multiple vowels, but it's more about that part of the word, not about the rhythm of it or the syllables or how many vowels or consonants it has. It's about that one meaningful part of the word. So how about a word like where we include masa into it, or isak in. There's three meaningful parts to that word. Isak means to respect, stach is each other, and in is a command for let us. So we can distinguish those are three meaningful parts. We didn't break it down by syllables, by phonemes, but we broke it down into its meaningful morphemes.
Oh.
Right? Okay?
Yeah.
We're almost there.
So by breaking it down into morphemes, though, you sort of have to know the words.
Right.
It helps to have a better understanding of the different parts of the word, yeah. But what you can start to do is by comparing it to other words, like what we've done in some of the exercises, that this must be one of those small meaningful parts because I see it here or I hear it here in these other words. And then we can start to distinguish that without even knowing. We can start to interchange those pieces. Some of the meaningful parts, the morphemes, become very useful for us. Mahsa or mehsa, depending on the pronunciation of your dialect, means to want. And that's a meaningful part that can get inserted to something. So if you want something, you can start to add that in. And we start to we make mistakes and we start to learn from that also. So if we say we want to go home, washik is to go home. Washik mahsa is to want to go home. Washik mahsak in central, do you want to go home? Right? We're adding the K, that's a meaningful part. We're adding the mahsa, which is to want. And washik is the root of to go home, right? We could break the washik down into what and to shik, but that's not essential for us to do right away. See, we wouldn't necessarily know right away where exactly break those. Just start with the ones that make sense to break down first. Sometimes that's just mood endings. We understand this is a mood ending, that's a separate meaningful part. Sometimes we recognize a part like mahsa or matsuk or other parts that it can fit inside that get attached to the root and we understand that it means a specific thing. We might not know what it means, but we might know that this part at the beginning and this part at the end are meaningful. So naturally, this part in the middle must be important and mean something. So we might have to refer to the English translation to try to figure out what that part means. If that doesn't help us, we have to ask a speaker or look through different resources to try to find out specifically what that one part means, that morpheme. So we're not going to know right away necessarily, but what we can start to figure out is that our words are made up of multiple morphemes, of meaningful parts, and we can figure out some of them, maybe not all, but sometimes we'll get all of them. And once we start to understand those different pieces, we can start to apply them to different words and start constructing our own words and sentences. So that's the goal that we're working toward. Okay?
That's the thing, and we start thinking in the language, not just speaking it.
So we have two more assignments, or maybe, no, 25, 26, 27, 24 more exercises to quickly go through.
Holy, you're like on fast forward.
I know.
We're going to go through exercises 25 to 28, and 25 starts on page 17 on handout number 9. The question here, or the exercise, use dashes to divide these English and Neutronal words into morphemes. So we just talked about this.
So that's into the meaningful parts.
Yeah. Identify which morphemes are roots, prefixes, and suffixes. In English, it's a little trickier because there isn't as many meaningful parts and morphemes. Like happy, we can't really break that down, not unless we have a really good understanding of the origin of where these words come from. Maybe we have to have a really good background in Latin and other things, right? But we don't. So happy is just one standalone word. That's the root. We could look at happiness and understand that ness at the end is a meaningful part. It's changed the meaning of it, and it's been added on. With fasten, we know that fast is a word, a standalone word by itself, so that's a root. The en added to it is a meaningful part that's been attached to it to change its meaning. Therefore, it's a morpheme. When we look at Neutronals, we might not know what the word means, but we're fortunate in these lists that we get the English translation also provided to us. When we don't know what the word is specifically, and we don't know where to separate those meaningful parts, that's when it's really important to have other words to compare it to. That's why these are all listed in triplicates, right? So uchkak, uchkmis, and uchkshik are all referring to fog. So we can understand that, okay, there's a common part that's referring to fog in each of these. What is the common sound or common word part, morpheme, that is found in each of those words? Well, if we look at it in closer analysis, we notice that uchk is the common link between all three of those words. Uchk must be the root that means fog. Then we know we can draw a dash or a line there, and we can separate. After uchk, there's ak. Ak is a meaningful part. I don't know what it means, but that's a meaningful part. Uchk, miss. Miss is a meaningful part. We might not know exactly what it means.
Yeah. And I was like, what's foggy and cloudy and how are they connected? Long ways, not down.
And then uchk shik, it means to get foggy. So then we can separate the shik from uchk. So then we know that uchk is the root, and shik, miss, and ak are meaningful morphemes. Okay, now let's look at the English translation. Uchkak means foggy. Uchk miss is just fog in general. And uchk shik is to get foggy. So shik must mean to get or become or to start being or something along those lines. Miss must mean sort of just the object altogether of fog, the state of being foggy. And so uchk ak has to do with the foggy aspect, the sort of the state of it being, I guess, in the midst of fog, right? That it's foggy all around you.
Many, right?
Many?
So many
Yes.
you couldn't count.
Miss, yeah, that's one way to look at it. You could say that it's a whole bunch of small parts that make up one whole, is one way to think of it.
So much you can't count.
Another way is that sometimes we use miss to turn a verb or like an adjective, a describing word, right? An adjective is a describing word. We use miss to turn an adjective into a noun, into a person, place, or thing, right? That's another way that we can articulate miss. It's not easy. There's no one way to articulate what miss means because it only means something in Newtonal. It's not meaningful in English in this way. So it's hard to articulate it in English unless you have comparable data to analyze with one another, and then you break that understanding up yourself, right? So that's what that exercise is focusing on, breaking down those parts. And I think we have already touched on that. So I'll skip to the next one, which is exercise number 26 on page 18. We're still on handout 9. And it says, how many stems are in each of these words? Okay, so now we know what a root is. A root is often found at the very beginning of a Newtonal word. Where are we? Right here. So a root is at the very beginning. And so that counts as one stem. A stem is any part of a Newtonal word that can have another piece attached to it. Once we get to the end, usually that's a mood ending, and that ends it off. Not always. So we can't say that it's all the time a mood ending is going to be the very last part. But in most cases, when we have a mood ending at the end, we can't add anything onto a mood ending. It turns into another word in that sentence. So we need a glue word or a joiner word that kind of gets separated from it. And then we add another word after, and it becomes a complex sentence. It's two sentences wrapped into one. So quite often, a mood ending will act like a period or a punctuation mark that stops it, right? I say that it doesn't do that all the time because there are some suffixes that come after a mood ending, but it's not used all the time. An example is shachyuti ah. Shachyuti is you take care. Shachyuti ah is habitual, like you always take care, right? So we added ah at the end of a mood ending. So there's an example of where sometimes there will be a part that comes. So in that example, shahyut is one word. That means in Central we use that for being well. It is a command. So you be well. It. And then ah is a habitual, ongoing, or always be. So there's three meaningful parts. Nothing can be added to ah. Nothing can be put after ah. There's no suffixes that can get attached to that. So that doesn't count. Ah, that part doesn't count as a stem because nothing can be attached to that. So in that word, there's only two stems, shahyut and shahyut e, because you can add ah to shahyut e. You can even add ch to shahid itch and make it plural, right? But you can't add anything to off, so that's not a stem. That's the difference between a root and a stem. You can keep adding more things to a stem, or not, sorry, that's not the difference between a root and a stem. That's the difference between a stem and a complete sentence or word, is that you can't add anything onto when it's complete, but stems, you can add something else onto it. It means that it's open and that it can still have something added to it. So there's some examples that are provided here. Uyak, mis, nak, hak. So it's already broken it down into the different stems for you here. It's broken it down to the different parts. And then you can see that the only part that can't have something added to it is at the very end after the K. So how many is there? There's uyak, uyak mis nak, uyak mis nak ha. So there's 4 stems in that one phrase, right? That's,
Okay.
Yeah. The next one, it's us, with us, with us, with us, eh. And then you add it's at the end of that, and that one doesn't count as a stem because nothing can be attached to that. So there's 5 stems on that one there. And that's what the exercise is asking you to identify. All right?
So then they want us to do, is it just those?
I just did them for you there, yeah.
I was gonna say, like, do I have to do that to 8 and 9?
No. That's on compounding, and that's on
Oh.
vowel length. So those are just
Well, it's
for
already laid
in-class
out
discussion.
anyway.
Yeah. And so the exercise 26 is just strictly for example 6 and 7 below it. Exercise number 27, both English and New channels build words by ablaut. Which of these past tense verbs and plural nouns are formed by affixation and which by ablaut? So ablaut is when a vowel gets changed. A vowel completely gets changed and changes the meaning of the word. The example provided here is sing and sang, right? The I become an A, and that is ablaut. When the vowel is changed and changes the meaning of the word. I to A, right? So that's an example of ablaut. Stare and stared isn't ablaut because there's a suffix being attached to it, and it's not changing the vowel sound, it's adding a consonant at the end in this case. Break and broke.
That's ablaut.
Ablaut, right.
Yeah.
Warn and warned.
No.
Nope, that's a suffix being added at the end. Or affixation, right? That's any pieces that get added on. Girl and girls, not ablaut. Man and men,
Yes.
ablaut. Foot and feet,
Yes?
yes, ablaut. Idea and ideas,
No.
no, affixation. There you go. That was exercise 27. Exercise 28, one paragraph down, same page, 18, handout 9. New channel forms plurals by affixation, reduplication, and changes in vowel length. For each of these plurals, say which of these processes is used. What we might notice in some of these words is it's not only one type of format that's used to make a plural. Sometimes we see a lengthening of vowel plus an infix, that's being added. And one of those examples is in ma'as. See the singular word for ma'as, which is like a house or dwelling? The plural word is ma'as. So we've noticed 2 things here. Both of the A's have become longer. So we see vowel lengthening, but somehow a T showed up in there. That's an infix. That's called an infix when another sound, another morpheme, or another sound is inserted in. And for pluralization in the new channel, it might be good for you to know that that's usually a T or a K sound as an infix. Matmas is the T being added in. Hakwak is one way of saying girls. So it's a reduplication and a T is being added in. So that's a vowel change, a vowel length change, and an infix of a T being added. So there's the example. Hakwak is a singular word for a young woman, and hakwak is a plural for young women. And so it's added a T, and it's reduplicated that first syllable. So that example there is a reduplication and an infix. With the last example, chlutsma and chlutsmeh, we're seeing a suffix being added, so that's affixation. It's a suffix being attached to a root that's changing it from singular to plural. Koas, we see kot koas is plural for koas, people. So now we see that that's a reduplication of the first syllable, ko, and there's a T that's being added in there too. So as I mentioned, with pluralization, if there's going to be an infix, usually we see it being a T and sometimes even a K, but more often than not, it's a T. Some people say nananiaksu for grandparents. Just singular, grandparent is naniaksu. Grandparents is often nananiaksu. Some dialects say not naniaksu, not naniaksu. So you hear the T in there, but it's still a reduplication, right? Any other questions on that?
Yeah, so this infix and affix that appears inside of the stem. So this definition on page 17.
Right, yeah, so the definitions for infix and for those are listed under the terms at on handout 9 on page 17. You can go a little further down to the bottom of the list of terms and you'll see affixation, which is making a new word by adding an affix. And it says that an affix is a morpheme that is added to a stem. So that could be any type of, you could call any of those an affixation, as long as it doesn't come before the root. A prefix comes before the root. A suffix is an affix that appears at the end of its stem, and usually at the very end of the stem. And an infix is an affix that appears inside of the stem. So it just pops up inside like that T.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, yep. And that's an infix. And it's just kind of pops inside.
Just jumps in.
Yeah. And for pluralization, again, that's usually a T. So we can see that as a number of examples in these that are listed here.
Did you say D earlier? No,
T or
K.
K.
Oh,
So here's an example of the K instead of a T.
Okay.
Kwa'uts. You see it? Ka'uts, it says. Oh, that's not the one. I'm familiar with Kwa'uts for grandchild, but this is a different dialect, I guess. Ka'uts is the word for grandchild. Kakuts is the plural. So it's not a T,
okay.
it's a K there. And that is an infix, the K, right? Okay, so that's that for those exercises. The last one is the interlinear analysis of at least one sentence containing 4 words. And I'm not sure if we want to or need to go into that at this time. We have talked about the interlinear analysis, so let's just take one last quick look at this. There's 2 examples that are provided in handout 10.
Sorry, what page is that?
This is page 19, handout 10, and we're looking at interlinear analysis. The first example, number 1, gives an example of a 3-line interlinear analysis that strictly has the analyzed example, the interlinear translation, and the natural translation into English. What it's excluding is the natural example in the neutronic phonetic writing. When we talked about this earlier, I was personally talking about my preference and how I like to use the 4-line because I like to see it in the natural neutronic phonetic writing first, because sometimes that's what looks most confusing to us. And then we try to figure out, well, how do we break that down, right? When we see a long neutronic word. That's why I think it's helpful to include that, have a 4-line interlinear analysis that would start with that, then it would break it down into its meaningful parts, then it would translate those meaningful parts, and then it would put it into a natural translation into English. And so the example that's provided here, wiktum yis yip. So we can see that it's already been broken down into meaningful parts and translated, and that means I didn't catch a lot. The second example with a 4-line interlinear analysis is chu, klukum, tupshik, sorry. So then it's broken down into its meaningful parts, interlinear analysis, chu, klut, uk. And on here it shows as im, then tupshik, and eek. This is tricky because we don't know what parts of the word might have been dropped. When suffixes are added on, when affixation occurs and other parts are added to a stem, sometimes we drop consonants, sometimes we drop vowels, sometimes it becomes a Y. And there's different rules that we eventually become more used to when we become more familiar with different examples of these types of words. We won't know that immediately right away. So we won't know that tupshik should be tupshik plus eek, right? So we might not know where to draw that line. We could guess first, and that's okay. If we're guessing and we take an educated guess on what it might be, then you're at least trying to break it down into meaningful parts, and then you can understand where you went wrong and where that change takes place. Quite often in our language, our root words end with shik, because that's just the state of being for that particular word. So kluk shik is a word that we use for wake up. Kluk shik. It might not be the same in Berkeley, but I'll use it as an example for Central. Kluk shik. And so when we add on a command for somebody to wake up, we would say kluk shi e. What happened is there was a barred L that was there before, kluk shik, but when we're adding on that special suffix, which is a command, e, we drop the barred lambda. But we should know that it was there. We don't always know, because we don't always know the root word in its entirety. We might only see a word and we only see the very first syllable of the root word that we're familiar with, right? So just breaking it down into those meaningful parts. Don't worry about adding the full root or anything like that, or the vowels that suddenly are missing, or the consonants that are suddenly dropped and missing, right?
Just go with the information that you have.
Just go with what you have and the best understanding that you have, and you'll do okay. Those other parts will make more sense after. When you start to transfer between different aspects, that's what that's called. And that has been proven to be very challenging for a lot of our learners, to go through aspects. It's not, because it's just not as common in English, it's just a concept that we're not fully familiar with, but New Channel is very dependent on it. And so those aspects will change the meaning of the word drastically. And it's important for us to know that later. Right now, it's mostly important to be able to take a New Channel sentence that consists of at least 4 words, break it down into the meaningful parts so we can understand, try our best to translate those meaningful parts, and then put it into free-flowing English translation at the bottom. That's the task that we're left with at the very end. And the task that we're going to have the second weekend of this course is going to be that amplified. We're going to be doing a much larger body of text, and going through line by line and doing an interlinear analysis of way more words. And we're going to have a lot of questions about all those meaningful parts. That's why Adam has shared this list here. And he has a handout that has listed quite a few more. And there's many, many, many different forms of affixes, parts that can get connected to stems.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there's lots. And for me, it's been mostly about memorization. Knowing what it means is important, of course, but memorizing all those different affixes is kind of just part of it. And it's about repetition and hearing those affixes with different words and how relatable they are. So when we say what shik is like go home, like you're already at home, or to go home. What shik. So the shik at the end is that aspect that's making that. What you is another form. Wath shik, as we were practicing earlier, extending the vowel length at the beginning is changing the meaning of it. So there's all these minor changes that can happen in a word, and we can suddenly open up our vocabulary even bigger. Because many of us start off with basic words, colors, numbers, objects, common objects. And this is an opportunity for us to be able to build upon that vocabulary that we've already established to a certain degree. Now we can, by the end of this, hopefully start to construct some sentences that we weren't able to construct before, right? Or we might have memorized sentences, especially in prayer, but we don't know exactly what the full breakdown of it meant. We know the English translation, but we don't know necessarily exactly what each of those parts in the New Channel word mean, why it means that in English. So when we break it down to all the morphemes, then it helps us, because we can take those parts and add it to different roots and make different sentences and different words.
That's why I'm really interested in taking this course, is because we've accepted a few things in translation, because it's more natural to think about it in English that way. But I really want to know what it means in Channel and how we develop that, because I hear people say Yamasakwasua, and I've been told that means I love you. But I'm like, I noticed that Yamasakwasua has the same kind of word as Yamasakli, which means like hurt butt.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, okay, so what part of this is the same in hurt butt than I love you? And I was like, does it have to mean like I hurt you, I hurt for you, I hurt with you, like what part of this means the same thing? And I'm really looking forward to starting to break apart my language and getting into it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And that's a good example word too. Like ya is the root in that word.
Or does it mean like?
Because then you'll hear it in a different way of saying it, right? You say, you could say yamas in that sense, or you could say yaak, right? So what we're seeing is that they essentially mean the same thing, but there's a slight difference. In the English translation, we might lose that piece, that's the difference between yaak and yatmis,
Yeah.
right?
And that's what I'd like to get into.
Yeah. But what in that part that you have, akli at the end refers to the rear end. Akli, just so you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
True.
Oh, what did Verena say?
Oh,
she
okay.
said cool.
Good.
She said hi earlier.
Oh.
Well, where is that?
This in the top chat, you can see her chatting away with us. Partway through, I waved at her and I said hi, and she said hi back. And we've got one lone person watching us the whole way through. We've had
Nice.
people check in and out, but I
Yeah.
could see that Verena had been watching the whole way through.
That's
Yeah,
perfect.
I'm just gonna do a sign off for those who are there still. Okay, so you guys made it to the end. Good night, Verena. Sleep well. For those of you who are watching it, like, tomorrow or the next night or, on Saturday when you should be doing your homework.
I see you running a bunch of courses through there.
Yes, I would like to end my stream.
Well, I hope that brought a bit more clarity to it. I know that it can be overwhelming, or it can be